Good morning. It's great to be with you here again, and we're continuing our teaching series called Turning the Tables, where we're looking at stories and teaching from the life of Jesus and how he often turns things around from what we would otherwise expect. And today's story is not going to be any different. It is the story of the Shrewd Manager from Luke chapter 16. Now, Jesus often spoke in parables and shared different teaching in the form of stories. And you're probably familiar with many of the parables. And some of them have a little bit of a similar message to them, such as the parable of the talents, the parable of the vineyard, the parable of the rich fool, the parable of the wise and foolish servants, the parable of the 10 virgins, and the parable of the watchful servants. And often these parables have a similar kind of pattern to them. Many of them are about a manager who's put in charge of some things while his master goes away. Sometimes the master goes away to a foreign country or goes to a foreign land or is away for a period of time. And he entrusts his resources and possessions and his vineyard or his business to some people. And he wants to come back and then see how they've done. This sort of parable is easily linked to the story of what Jesus has done with us. Jesus, as the master, has entrusted us with some resources. He's entrusted us with his mission. He's gone away to be with the Father, return to heaven. And one day he's promised to come back. And he wants to see how we've done in the meantime. And so there's kind of this message that comes through with these parables. And then we come to today's parable, the parable of the shrewd manager. And it kind of picks up some of these themes. But this is the first parable that came along that really took me by surprise. And we get the chance to look at that here together today. Luke chapter 16 is where we find the story of the shrewd manager. So if you have Bibles with you or pull it up on your phone or your device, we're going to read it through together. But we're going to read it through verse by verse and blow by blow kind of as we go. We're not going to read it all at once. Now you can skip ahead and read it if you like, but we're going to go through verse by verse and look at things as we go. So we're going to pick up Luke chapter 16 and verse 1. And this is how it starts. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions." As George and Dan covered in the last couple of weeks, the audience here is the disciples, but it's not just the disciples. It says here, Jesus told his disciples, but we know that there were tax collectors and Pharisees, teachers of the law, who are sitting in the audience. And so Jesus has also been speaking to them in this context. And this particular story follows on from the parable of the lost son, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and particularly the last one that we heard about last week, the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son. And it's the story, as you know, of the son who wastes his father's possessions. And when he returns, the father welcomes him back, throws a big party, and the older brother is very upset by that. And the Pharisees could see themselves in that. They wouldn't dare be the ones to waste the father's money or waste the resources. They would be faithful, good stewards, good servants, and they feel really offended about that particular story that Jesus was kind of pointing towards them as the older brother, that they need to actually come and join the party and join in a relationship with the Father as well. So this particular parable picks up, and it's got a similar piece in it that also is targeted at the Pharisees. They would have been thinking about the prodigal son, and they would have been thinking, gosh, that's unfair. How could he have treated the prodigal son so well and the older brother not so well? And they would have begun to think that the father is really wasteful. He throws this massive party, and so he kind of turned things upside down on its head. And so that's the context that Jesus tells this story about a manager who's accused of being wasteful with his master's possessions. So this man in the story, the shrewd manager, is a steward of the resources of the master. And in today's terms, probably the best concept that we can think about is like a financial planner, someone that you might entrust your resources to and hope that you're going to get a good return on that. Like a manager or investor, maybe you put some funds into a mutual fund, your Kiwi saver, and you hope that they do a good job of looking after these things. And so this particular manager was a manager who was in charge of the master's resources, like his finance manager. Now, probably George should be the one talking about this story today. He knows a lot more about investment and funds and managing resources than I do. But today's story is kind of picking up some of these things, and there's a bit of an underlying theme of investment. Now, I've just started Sharesies. I don't know if anyone else here has got the Sharesies app and started Sharesies, but I've just kind of started it last week, put a few dollars in there, and I am proud to tell you today that I have amassed the total profit of $1.86. $1.86. I think I'm doing pretty well in my investment record so far. But anyway, well, I know I should probably leave it to the experts to trust things too. But that's kind of the concept of this manager. He's a manager who's in charge. He's a steward in charge of the resources. And the master is hoping that this guy's been looking after his resources well. But he's accused of being wasteful. So verse 2, he calls him in and he asks him, "What is this I hear about you? Can you give an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer?" So this shrewd manager, this financial manager looking after the master's resources, he's been caught out. He's been found that he's being wasteful. Now, we don't get any details about what he did or how he was wasting the resources. You know, it's a bit like you give your money to a financial manager and suddenly the financial manager's got a new car and a new boat and a new beach house. And you think, hey, is that my money he's using? Well, this manager somehow was accused of wasting the resources that had been invested, put in his trust to be taken care of for the master. We don't know what the details are, but he loses his job. He gets fired. And so the manager then, in verse 3 and 4, he says this. He says, well, what shall I do now? I'm losing my job. My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm too ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he's a pretty smart manager. He realizes that he's losing his job. He doesn't want to go and start digging drains and trying to earn a living that way. And he doesn't want to go on the street and beg for money. So he tries to come up with a plan to think about how he can get through this situation. Now, before going on to get to the point and seeing what he does, there's a couple of things that I noticed about this manager and his attitude for a start. The first thing is he says, what shall I do now? And that's really kind of the starting point. Everything's changed for him. His world's being turned upside down. And he says, what shall I do now? And then he comes to the moment where he says, I know what I will do. I know what I will do. And it made me kind of stop and marvel about the way that he is able to change. Or to use a COVID word, to pivot. I'm kind of a bit tired of hearing the word pivot. But essentially the manager is in a situation, everything around him has changed. And he says, what am I going to do now? And so he has a little bit of time, a little bit of a think, and he says, I know what I'll do. And so he comes up with a plan. The shrewd manager, he quickly adapts to the situation that he's in, and he works out how he can make it work for him. And you know, this all happens very quickly, or seemingly very quickly. And change experts say that, when we're faced with situations or a new reality, that the quicker that we accept that reality, acknowledge it, and make a plan for the future, the sooner we can get onto the path for recovery. To this point of the pandemic, I haven't personally experienced, terrible health impact or economic impact. Who knows what's down the track, but many people around the world have been experiencing those things. But what I do know, that almost everything about my work life has changed. Everything I used to do, I'm not able to do so much. I'm spending a lot more time, probably like many of you, on Zoom conference calls. And it's really tiring. The change is tiring. And I wonder, how are you going with the changes? As you kind of look back in the last 6 months, there's been a lot of change that we've all experienced. And maybe you feel tired, and maybe you're thinking, what'll I do now? What is my next step? It's probably affected us all in a variety of ways. A couple of weeks ago, I got to go to a seminar by a guy called Nick Allen. And Nick Allen is a mountaineer. He's a young guy. He's used to be very fit and energetic. and he got a diagnosis of MS, multiple sclerosis. And he found that he was in a completely new situation. And he's undergone a number of things, and since his diagnosis, he's been able to go back and do some mountain climbing and different things. But it's been a big challenge. And he was just sharing about how do you cope when your whole world is turned upside down. And he shared a few points, and he said the first thing is that you need to accept the challenge, acknowledge the challenge that's there, and accept the things that you can't change. But then he says we need to think about developing new skills to build in margin to help us cope with the change, and to build community around us in order to move forward. But it seems like, one of the best ways as we think about all the change that's happening around us is to think like the shrewd manager, what will I do now? And come to the point of accepting the change and then thinking, I know what I'll do, and trust God for that new situation. So the shrewd manager, what does he decide to do? His whole world, the way he'd been operating has changed. What is he going to do next? We pick up the story in verse 5. Here's what he did. Now it's a pretty cool little strategy. He says, I know what I'll do. So he called each one of his master's debtors and he asked them, how much do you owe my master? And the first one says 900 gallons of olive oil, which is quite a lot of olive oil. The manager said to him, well, take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 450. So he halves the guy's debt that he owes to the master. And you can imagine what the guy's thinking. He's thinking, this is a great deal. Then he pulls the second guy in. He says, how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. Well, take your bill and make it 800. And so he goes through his master's debtors and he halves their bills. He's thinking, I've got a little bit of time. I've got a little bit on my plate that I think some things that I can change and do right now to set up a plan for the future. He knows how people work. He wants to be welcomed into the future, into these people's houses. And so he comes up with this shrewd plan to take the master's debts and the amounts that they owe his master and reduce it so that these people will welcome and like him and treat him as a friend once he loses his job. Pretty clever plan, right? He knew how people think and work. Although it was at the expense of the master and his resources, he made sure that after his job was gone, he would still have people to take care of him. It's pretty clever. This is why he's called the shrewd manager. Well, how's this plan going to work out? We know the master's going to come back, and what's he going to say about what's happened? Well, pick it up in verse 8, and this is the piece that really surprised me. Verse 8 says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Well, he commends him for being shrewd and a bit dishonest. And you kind of think this is a turning the tables moment. Jesus kind of flips it over and says, this is not what you were expecting. The audience would have been sitting there in shock and bewilderment. He's really challenging their values of what it means to be a good steward, to be a good manager. Well, what is the point of this and where is this story going? And the next verse shows that it actually gets even more controversial for the audience that Jesus is listening to. Because Jesus goes on to verse 9 and he says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. It's a pretty incredible statement that Jesus makes. Jesus' main lesson, it seems to be, is this. Use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself in eternity so that you'll be welcomed into eternity. In other words, use the resources that you're in charge of now for eternal benefits. Now, what can he possibly mean by this and how do we unpack it? Well, let's dig in a little bit. Jesus says that the people of this world who operate in this temporal world, they know how the world economy works. So they're smart and they know how to use it for what they want. They know how to play the game. Now, the master, he may have been a shrewd man himself, and so he admires what he sees in this shrewd manager. And Jesus implies that we, as Christians, as people of the light, could learn a thing or two from people when it comes to planning for the future. And I think Jesus' point is quite simple, really. He asks the question, how smart are we really when it comes to using our resources? How smart are we when it comes to planning for the future? You know, Jesus makes the point that this world is not our true home, that we have an eternity, we have a heavenly home waiting for us. That is where we're going to spend eternity. That the amount of time that we spend here on this life is going to be a small part of what eternity is going to be like. We are citizens of heaven. And so his challenge is, where should we be focusing our efforts and our energy and our resources? You know, one day, just like the manager in this story, we're going to have to leave this life and all that we've stored up here. But what provisions have we made for the next? Jesus' lesson is that we are to use the resources that he's entrusted us with here on earth to ensure that we are welcomed into eternal homes. You know, we are not owners here. We are basically managers. We are like the manager in this story, that we've been entrusted in this earthly life with a few resources from the Master, from the King, from Jesus himself. And he says we should use this resource, the things he's given us, for his kingdom purposes, to ensure that we get a well done, good and faithful servants, and that we are welcomed into eternal dwellings. You know, that's probably going to be a better return than I'm going to get on Sharesies. Now, putting money in Sharesies is great, but you know, God has placed us on this earth, and he's given us a little bit of time, a little bit of talent, and a little bit of treasure. And he wants us to use these things to accomplish his purposes. And he's gone away for a period of time, and he's going to come back, and he's going to see what we've done with those things. If we have time, he wants us to use it for his kingdom. If we have some treasure, he wants us to invest it for his kingdom. If we have some talents and resources, he wants us to invest those for his kingdom. You know, he has left everything in our stewardship. We don't own any of what we've been given. We are like managers who've been placed in charge of his affairs, and one day he's going to call us and ask us to give an account. How smart are we going to appear on that day? How wise will our investments of time and talent and treasure look at that time? How well do we understand God's values and God's eternal economy? I want to come back into this in a minute, because Jesus makes a couple of other points in here that I think are important. In verse 10 to 12, he says, whoever can be trusted with little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? So Jesus is not commending the dishonesty of the manager. What he's pointing out is the shrewdness and the way he's thinking about the use of resources. And he basically says that our lives now are a test to see if we can be trusted with greater things in the future. His main point is that we are to be trustworthy stewards, that what we've been given now is a test with our temporal earthly things to see how we would go with true riches, with eternal things. And then verse 15, he says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And the Pharisees who loved money are listening to this. They heard it and they sneered at Jesus and Jesus said to them, you are the ones who justify yourself in the eyes of God, but God knows your hearts. And see, the real test is of our hearts, of where our focus is. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What we really value comes out in the way that we spend our time, our talent, and our resources. The rules by which the game that we're playing become evident by the way that we are investing our time, talent, and resources. Jesus says we can't serve both God and money. We will serve one or the other, and he knows our heart. And in the final part of this verse, God again turns the tables on us. And Jesus says, what people value is highly detestable in God's sight. Pretty strong words, but Jesus often uses the parables to make pretty radical and strong statements in order to get across his point. And this last point, he comes back to what God's values and how they compare with our values. That sometimes what we value is not what God puts at the highest value. And I think this is where we come to this concept that I want to call eternal economics. Now, I actually trained as an economist at university, and I went to work for the government for several years as an economist. But what I remember the most was my high school economics teacher saying that economics is the study of how we use our scarce resources to satisfy our needs and wants. Economics is the study of how we use our scarce resources to satisfy our needs and wants. So that, in a sense, is the earth or the world's view of economics. It's about using the resources to satisfy our needs and wants. Well, are those God's economics? Is that what God values? I want to suggest to you that eternal economics is the study of how we use God's resources, things entrusted to us, to maximize his kingdom and eternal purposes. That kingdom economics, or eternal economics, is how we use his resources for maximum kingdom and eternal purposes. See, it's all about perspective. It's all about whether we are focused on the here and now, this temporal, earthly perspective, or the eternal perspective. If we have a temporal and earthly perspective, this story is a little shocking. But it makes sense because the shrewd manager, he's a survivor and he comes up with a cunning plan. But if we think about it from an eternal or heavenly perspective, we can see that Jesus is saying that we need to be smart in the way that we use the things he's given us now, not just for these purposes on earth here, but for eternal purposes, for his kingdom purposes. See, investment is all about what we do now with the resources entrusted to us so that there would be a benefit and that we would be better off in the future. And Jesus is saying to us, use the resources that you have now to work for kingdom benefit, not just for you, but for all of God's eternal kingdom purposes. You know, what might make sense now from a temporal perspective in the way we use our time and talent and resources may actually be incredibly wasteful when looked at the light of what God values and what he sees as important. I actually have here a $20 billion note. I am a multi-billionaire. Now, this is from Zimbabwe, and you might remember that the Zimbabwe government got into a lot of trouble many years ago, and they began printing money. And so they printed so much of it that it was practically worthless. And I think by the time I bought this, it was worth a few cents. $20 billion. So good lesson to all the governments out there printing money. It's not a good long-term plan. But this is really kind of worthless now. When it comes to eternity, and we have our money and our resources, and we cross over to the other side of eternity, and we pull out our earthly dollars and notes, what are they going to be worth? What is going to be the value in God's sight? You know, a few months ago, many of the things that I thought were of value or of significance, what are they worth now? You know, how is my gold frequent flyer status working now with the airlines? You know, I haven't flown anywhere pretty much all year. Or how about my stocks? If I've got stocks in hotels, or should I put them in Zoom? A lot of things have turned tables on us. And it's a good reminder and lesson for us to be thinking about what are we investing in and how does that pay forward into the future. So, pulling all this together, Jesus' main point, I think, from this story of the shrewd manager is that he wants us to use the resources that have been entrusted with us now for eternal benefit. And that we need to think about what God's priorities and values are. Now, I want to come back to give you some investment tips before we go. Now, what does God value and what is going to be a good long-term eternal investment for us? Well, I want to go back to the last few weeks of our series together. What does God value? God values people. Last couple of weeks, we learned about the story of the lost coin. and the lost sheep. And then we also read the story about the prodigal son. And it says in there that there is much rejoicing over people who return to God. And so one of the best investments that we can make is returning to God and helping others do the same, to make eternal friends, if you like, to make disciples. Jesus rejoices when people return and come back to him. So if you want to invest in eternity, invest in people and their eternal future. Take the opportunity to share your faith with them. Take the opportunity to give and invest in mission that are helping people come to know him. Secondly, Jesus values and God values people and us caring for them. In the next week, I'm going to steal a little bit of the thunder. The next story after this one is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man lived it up on earth, and Lazarus was poor. And the rich man didn't go out and care and look after him. And so Jesus values those things, the opportunities that we have to go out and care and invest in others' lives, to share with them the things that we have. God can use for our eternal purposes. When Rodney Stark, who was a secular historian, he wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, and he goes back to the very first century, and he's asking the question, what caused Christianity to grow so much? And at that time, there were various natural disasters, epidemics that went throughout the Roman Empire, and it was said that the Christians took the time to go and care for those who were suffering and struggling in the pandemic. While many other people in the first century fled the cities and left, it was the Christians who stayed in the urban areas and cared for others during the plagues and the epidemics, ministering and caring for the sick. They had a completely different set of values, and that actually contributed to the massive growth of Christianity in the first centuries, as people saw that, and they saw that the way that the Christians behaved was so different to everyone around them. So God values these things. He values our eternal welfare, and he values the welfare of people today. God cares and invests in those things. And finally, I want to say that God cares about people. He cares about you and your character, and he wants you to invest in you. Now, one of the key aspects, I think, of this story is our personal growth, that God wants to invest in us. And it's our character and our growth, and the way that we can be setting up ourselves well for eternity is by getting to know him, by preparing for our eternal home and our eternal future. That he wants us to have a pure heart that's focused on him. He reminds us in this story that God knows our hearts. So I pray that as we look at this story, we would kind of turn the tables on maybe what some of the things that we think in terms of the way we're investing our time and talent and our treasure, and that we would think about these things not just from an earthly temporal perspective, but to think about them from an eternal perspective. How is it that God would view these things? He's put us in charge of a few things in these years that we have, and he's put us in charge, and he wants to come back and take a look and see what we've done with those things. And I hope that when he comes back, all of us will hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servants." Hope you have a great week.